On today's podcast, we are tackling a very sensitive subject and we are using source material from the time. Some people might find the language offensive. Hello and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today, the topic is abolition. Since tomorrow is the new federal and state holiday celebrating the end of slavery, June 19th or Juneteenth, we thought we would look at early abolitionists in the colonial period in the colonies and Britain. This topic is vast and very complex and extraordinarily hard to compress into a 30 to 40 minute podcast. So much so that we made it into a two-part podcast. Today, we're going to be focusing on early abolitionists from the British colonies, and in August, we'll do part 2, which will look at later British and American abolitionists into the 19th century. The hardest part talking about this topic is that so much of the anti-slavery movement in the 17th and 18th century was along the lines of hidden dissent. Many key players, the enslaved themselves, and ordinarily white colonists protested in an anonymous manner. He was influential, drove the point home that slavery was morally wrong, yet it's fairly unknown in the historical record. But we're going to start by discussing numbers.
The numbers are horrific. The slave trade from Africa to the Americas lasted from the mid-15th century to the mid-19th century. Most historians put the number of West Africans kidnapped either as prisoners of war or simply sold into slavery between 14 and 15 million people. The numbers loaded into the ships to carry them across the Atlantic were 12 million, perhaps 12.5 million. This means transporting the enslaved from the hinterlands from West Africa to the coast in ships was brutal, very violent, and resulted in 2 to 3 million deaths. The journey across the Atlantic in horrible conditions resulted in another 2 million deaths. Once the newly enslaved people arrived in the Caribbean or the Americans, an additional million died as they never recovered from the journey or acclimated to the new environment. In other words, 14 to 15 million people were captured to provide 9 million enslaved people to work, for the most part, on sugar plantations. An excellent book on the mid-Atlantic slave trade is The Slave Ship, A Human History by Marcus Rediker.
Almost all of the enslaved population, approximately 90%, ended up on sugar plantations. The work on sugar plantations was backbreaking and extremely dangerous, resulting in a life expectancy of 10 to 13 years. There was no natural increase in slave numbers on sugar plantations. The enslaved people were worked until death and then replaced with another enslaved person from Africa. The first sugar plantation on a British colony was in Barbados in 1641. Jamaica became a British colony by conquest from the Spanish in 1655, and very soon afterwards began establishing sugar plantations. These two colonies are going to drive the British into the slave trade and result in the expansion of slavery everywhere in British North America.
The slave trade was controlled by the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Dutch until the mid-18th century. The British entered into the slave trade in 1662 with the formation of the Royal African Company. The company was established by royal decree by King Charles II and was run by his brother, the Duke of York, the future King James II. The Royal African Company was promised a 1,000-year monopoly in regards to all trade with Africa, including enslaved people. Over the next 50 years, the company transported 150,000 enslaved individuals to the British colonies, mostly to Jamaica and Barbados. This was controversial, not for the reasons we would like it to be controversial, but because it was a monopoly. Many merchants protested, including 206 petitions to Parliament to break the company's hold on the slave trade. They formed a group called the Abolition of the Royal African Company. The first time, I believe, the use of the word abolition in regards to slavery. The group who are putting the petitions into Parliament argued deregulation would increase shipbuilding, increase the use of other ports in Britain besides London, lead to expansion in the New World, make slaves cheaper, be a job creator, and increase English liberty as it allowed English people to trade freely without state regulation. The hypocrisy is truly amazing, but the company was successful, and King William III dismantled the Royal African Company in 1698, and the African trade was open to all British companies as long as they paid the Royal African Company 10% of the profits. The 10% condition was repealed in 1712. This opened up a huge increase in slaves traded among British companies and the acceleration of slavery in the British colonies. The years between 1700 and 1808, more Africans were captured and shipped to the Americans, over two-thirds of the total during the slave era. More than 40% were transported on British and American ships. This amounted to 3 million individuals. The question we have while this was transpiring, who were the critics? Really, who were the first abolitionists in the way we understand the word in the 21st century, writing and fighting to end this trade and to end slavery in the British Atlantic world?
The most important abolitionists, the most numerous fighters against the institution of slavery, were the enslaved. This is very important in understanding the anti-slavery movement that formed in the 18th century and grew substantially in the 19th century, because it was always driven by the enslaved and by their actions in fighting this unjust and immoral condition. This was done by revolts on slave ships, slowdowns or work stoppages on plantations, running away, the formation of maroon societies, and a few who managed to obtain freedom and then turned around to work tirelessly in bringing the conditions of slavery to the greater public in the hopes of changing society and ending slavery. The most famous African in this regard was Olaudah Equiano, and we will be talking about him in part 2. The first act of rebellion recently enslaved Africans could accomplish was the shipboard revolt. This was the first and sometimes only chance that recently enslaved Africans captured and taken from their homeland had to protest or attempt to find their freedom. Historians looking at the records conclude 350 ship revolts took place between 1698 and 1807. This turns out to be one revolt every 4 months for 100 years, or 10% of the ships sailing during this time period were faced with some kind of revolt. More than half of the revolts took place near the African coast. Sometimes ships were attacked by relatives of the captured Africans, sometimes the revolts were mass suicides. The slaver, the Prince of Orange, in 1737 had a revolt when 100 Africans jumped overboard, preferring death over the hopelessness of life on board the ships. Many Africans on board ships went on hunger strikes in defiance of their present situation. The most haunting description are how many ships' captains write of the moans and crying of the captured Africans upon waking up after sleeping and wondering why it was happening to them, why it was happening at all. One captain asked one of the captured women why they were moaning, and she explained they were dreaming of home and being free, and the harsh realities of their present situation were becoming apparent when they would wake up and then cry out in depression. Very few of these shipboard rebellions resulted in the overthrow of the crew. More likely, the crew retreated behind the barricade, which is a barrier on the deck of the ship, and fired their weapons into the Africans, killing as many as possible to restore order. The image of an insurrection on board a slave ship showing the crew firing onto the rebels, some of whom were leaping overboard, was used by abolitionists to show the disorder and the violence of the slave ship.
Sadly, there was very few tracts written against slavery in the 17th century. The religious group, I think, would be opposed to slavery, like the Puritans, the so-called godly people, worked themselves into strange logic to defend the practice. A Massachusetts 1641 Body of Liberties, that there shall never be any bond slavery among us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or sold to us. In other words, they justified Indian slavery as just and African slavery as just, and soon after the first slaves appeared in Massachusetts. The first white document against slavery was the Germantown Protest of 1688, written by German and Dutch Quakers in Germantown. This was a document sent to the Regional Council of the Quakers in Pennsylvania. The lead writer was Francis Daniel Pastoris, who wrote, quote, "Black Spiritism was the same as us." In other times, quote, writing, "Man-stealing is ranked among the most atrocious of crimes, and slavery was not legitimate but theft. Here is liberty of conscience, here ought to be likewise liberty of your body, but to bring men hither or to rob and sell them against their will, we stand against." And the document goes on to say, quote, "This makes an ill report in all these countries of Europe where they hear of that You Quakers do handle men as they handle your cattle, and for that reason some have no mind or inclination to come hither. End quote. While nothing came of this protest, it was the first time in writing in British North America of a group objecting to slavery and listing reasons why it was wrong and saying there was no difference between blacks and whites. The protest was read by the elite of the colony, and while it took decades for the Quakers to change their position on slavery, the document was very influential in making the elite think and ask some difficult questions concerning their beliefs and morality.
Judge Samuel Sewell of Boston, Massachusetts, didn't own any slaves, but he was actually related to many slave owners in the Boston area. He was a graduate of Harvard, a merchant, a diplomat, and later in life a judge. Around the turn of the century, he began thinking of slavery, and a case came before him that motivated him to put words to paper. The case involved a young enslaved man named Adam. The slaveholder, John Saffin, leased him to a farmer and promised Adam he would free him after 3 years if he behaved and caused no problems for the farmer. Adam did cause problems, and months later the farmer returned him. After 3 years, Adam demanded his freedom from Saffin, who refused, and then Adam sued him. The case landed before Judge Sewell. The judge told Saffin to free Adam by a certain date. The judge then wrote a pamphlet called The Selling of Joseph, where he wrote, quote, "Having been long and much dissatisfied with the trade of fetching Negroes from Guinea, I have a strong inclination to write something about it." End quote. He then went on to say, quote, "Man stealing is ranked among the most atrocious of capital crimes." End quote. He wrote against the curse of Ham, saying, quote, "Even if true humans have no right to do God's dirty work for him. All men, as they are the sons of Adam, are co-heirs and have equal rights unto liberty." He then went on to say, "Their continual aspiring after their forbidden liberty renders them unwilling servants." He saw no hope for assimilation and thought they had peculiar ways, and thought that slavery was preventing more whites from settling in North America, which makes him both an abolitionist and a racist all in one document. Pretty typical for the time period, actually. This pamphlet was for the most part forgotten about, and it was not until the Revolutionary War that abolition really became any sort of movement in Massachusetts. John Saffin wrote a pamphlet in response to Sewell, which is the only pro-slavery written document in the colonies till the Revolution, called A Brief and Candid Answer. Saffin wrote that the Bible clearly states that all humans are not equal, some were kings and some were slaves. This was the way of the world, and good Christian slave owners were doing a service by bringing Christianity and civilized behavior to the so-called savage Africans. In other words, in his opinion, slavery was good for the Africans. Sadly, this pamphlet did become popular, especially among slaveholders.
The next two abolitionists are Quakers, and this will be a trend until the Revolutionary War brings in abolitionists from all denominations and walks of life. The first is George Keith, who I believe was influenced by the Germantown protest, wrote a pamphlet called Exhortation and Caution to Friends Concerning Buying of Keeping of Negroes in 1693, basically saying the only reason a Quaker should own a slave is to educate the slave and then to free them. He writes, "There is no racial hierarchy and everyone should follow the golden rule." Keith also recommends if any Quaker, and really any Christian, if they owned any slave, should teach them to read, give them a Christian education, and free them. The next person of note is perhaps the most colorful, and it's also a very sad story. Benjamin Lay was born in 1682 in England. He was a hunchback and short. He was 4 feet, and his arms were longer than his legs. He was bullied as a child, learned the glove-making trade, which he hated, ran away and went to sea, returned to England, where he met his future wife, Sarah. Sarah was also 4 feet tall, and by all accounts, they were a very loving couple. They soon moved to Barbados to run a store. They looked at this as an opportunity to improve themselves and were horrified by the treatment of the enslaved population. The Lays soon realized they were part of the problem, even though they did not own any slaves. Lay writes, quote, "Sometimes I could catch them and I would give them stripes," which basically means he was whipping them. but I have been sorry for it so many times, and it does grieve me to this day, considering the extreme cruelty and misery they have always lived under. End quote. The Lays, once while out walking, came across a slave naked and hanging outside a fellow Quaker's home for running away, and decided they had enough and booked passage to Philadelphia. Lay is the first of many British people who were horrified by the conditions on Barbados and Jamaica for enslaved individuals. A case in point was Broad Street in Bridgetown, the capital of Barbados, where public cages holding runaway enslaved individuals were visible from the street. These individuals, often covered in their own feces because of the size of the cages, some in stocks or shackles, and stayed this way until they were collected by their owners. A runaway enslaved individual who invaded recapture for 30 days was automatically burned at the stake. Barbados changed people, a few becoming starch abolitionists, and the Lays were no exception. The Lays' relief of arriving in Philadelphia from the hell of Bridgetown was short-lived, as Sarah died soon after arriving in the city. The grief of losing Sarah sent Benjamin Lay into depression and eventually madness. Lay devoted the remaining 24 years of his life fighting slavery and wrote pamphlets spreading the message of the evils of slavery in as many Quaker meeting houses as possible. He set himself apart from slave owners and the products of slavery. So consequently, he lived in a cave, dressed in sackcloth so as not to wear anything that slavery helped made, walked everywhere instead of using a horse, became a vegetarian, and absolutely did not eat any sugar. His behavior became more and more bizarre, but he got his point across. He disrupted one Quaker meeting house service by dressing as a soldier and stabbing a Bible with a sword with berry juice in it so it would spurt blood, yelling, quote, "The bloodthirsty, godless mercenaries," end quote, meaning Quaker slave owners were no better than the godless mercenaries. He was thrown out of the service. One time, he kidnapped the daughter of a slaveholder, writing to the slaveholder, quote, "Your child is safe in my house, and you may now conceive the sorrows you inflict upon the parents of the Negro girl you hold in slavery, for she was torn from them by avarice," end quote. Still on another occasion, he disrupted a service and was thrown out of the meeting house. Lay then laid down on the threshold of the door, so all the people leaving the service had to step over him. Most of his life he was met with fury and scorn, but he also brought slavery into the public dialogue. Lay died in 1759, confused and isolated. Yet his tactics of shock, surprise, and shame were very successful in bringing attention to the matter of slavery, tactics that are still used today.
The next Quaker of note is John Woolman, a farmer's son who at the age of 21 began to work in a store. He wrote later he enjoyed the job until a slave owner asked for help in writing out a receipt for selling a female slave. Woolman did this and then felt tremendously guilty afterwards, possibly because he had read some of Lay's pamphlets, and decided he had no recourse but to leave storekeeping. He took up religion and became a traveling Quaker preacher. He traveled extensively over the colonies, always bringing up the topic of slavery, often to slaveholders when actually staying with them. His approach was soft compared to the bombastic shock tactics of Lay. In 1754, he wrote Considerations on Keeping Negroes, where he wrote, "Brethren, I entreat you, in the bowels of gospel love, seriously to weigh the cause of detaining Africans in bondage. If it be for your own private gain, or any other motive than their good, it's much to be feared that the love of God and the influence of the Holy Spirit is not the prevailing principle in you, and your hearts are not sufficient redeemed from the world." Woolman, using the soft approach, was on good terms with the Quaker leaders in Pennsylvania, and was very influential in bringing up the topic of slave ownership at the yearly meetings. The Pennsylvania Yearly Meeting of 1754 tackled the question of Quaker slaveholding and passed the following statement, quote, "To avoid in any manner encouraging that practice of making slaves of our fellow creatures," end quote. This resulted in the local meeting houses after 1758 beginning to excommunicate slave owners. The Pennsylvania Quakers had become anti-slavery.
Anthony Benzet was born in France to a Huguenot family in 1713. The family survived the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes because of powerful family connections. Soon after Anthony's birth, the family's luck ran out and they were forced to leave France. They moved first to Rotterdam and then to London, where there was a sizable Huguenot refugee community. When Anthony was 14, he joined the Quakers along with the rest of his family, and soon after, the family moved to Philadelphia in 1731. Benzay was influenced by John Woolman and interestingly tried his hand at being a merchant storekeeper. He began advocating that slave owning was not consistent with Christian doctrine. Soon Benzay became a teacher, and in 1750 he added night classes for black slaves and for free black children. Benzay soon formed his own school for girls in 1755, and in 1770 he founded the Negro School at Philadelphia for black children. Benzay was not only an educator, he was also a writer and became known as, quote, the single most prolific anti-slavery writer and the most influential advocate of the Negro's rights on either side of the Atlantic, end quote, and this is from someone from the 18th century. A theme throughout his writing was there was no difference between people of African descent and white Europeans. Benzay challenged the notion of black inferiority. He also started using third-party eyewitness accounts to show the horror of slavery and the slave trade.
Benzay's writings were written for certain audiences. His 1759 book, Observations on the Enslaving, Importing, and Purchasing of Negroes, was aimed at fellow Quakers who still owned slaves on how to avoid excommunication and comply with 1754 yearly meeting resolutions. His 1762 book, Short History of That Part of Africa Inhabited by the Negroes, denounced slaveholding as a violation of natural human rights and advocated for all Christians to free their slaves. In 1771, Benzay wrote Some Historical Accounts of Guinea, where he attacks the British elites in sponsoring and profiting from the slave trade. He describes the conditions of the Middle Passage and pushed for an anti-slavery movement on both sides of the Atlantic. He also began corresponding with Granville Sharp, an influential anti-slavery individual in London. The American Revolution slowed all the plans for a dual attack on slavery from Britain and the soon-to-be United States. Benzay then managed to convince the Continental Congress to ban the slave trade during the war. However, he managed to wear out his welcome to the Congress, so in 1778 he wrote Observations on Slavery, where he contrasted the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence in regards to slavery. Soon after, he lobbied members of the Pennsylvania legislature to abolish slavery in the state. While he did not get the law he was after, the legislature did pass a law to slowly abolish slavery. The numbers of slaves declined in the colony, and then the state of Pennsylvania officially outlawed slavery in 1847.
Now we are going to go back a few years to April 14th, 1775. Benzay and 10 prominent Philadelphians in the Rising Sun Tavern formed the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. This is the first organized anti-slavery society in the new country. They used the courts to intervene in returning free blacks who were kidnapped back into slavery. They also pushed for the manumission of all slaves. In 1784, the society changed its name to the, quote, Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and for the Relief of Free Negroes Held in Bondage, or as it became known as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Sadly, the tavern was demolished in 1890, and we are looking at a painting of the tavern drawn in the mid-19th century, and it looks like an ordinary house. The buildings where history is made often do not have to be grand. One of the last items Benzay managed to do before he died was have the Continental Congress in 1783 read an anti-slave trade petition signed by 535 Quakers. Southern delegates, all of them slave owners, blocked all discussion of the petition. Anthony Benzay died in 1784. Benzay was held in such high esteem by the black community that many of them marched in his funeral.
The one thing we haven't really discussed is the role of women in abolition. There are very few accounts of any real movers and shakers in the movement or any actual writings that are claimed by female authors previous to the turn of the century and going into the 19th century. There are a few that are named that we can actually trace, especially as history develops and we find out what's happening behind the scenes in the very end of the 18th century, but they are largely British abolitionists, and we will be dealing with that in the next half of this podcast in August.
While we focused on a few abolitionists, the key to remember during the 18th century was slavery was expanded. The abolitionists we focused on were really exceptional people considering the time and place. The elites in both Britain and the colonies, for the most part, were making huge amounts of money because of their investment in slavery, the slave trade, or owning slaves. The laws concerning slavery at this time were more likely to protect slave owners and more firmly protect the institution of slavery. The issue gets much more complicated during the Revolutionary War period, as slavery becomes a wedge issue between Britain and the colonies. Plus, writing about all men being created equal in a slave society opens up difficult logic problems for many individuals. The British, while protecting slavery in Jamaica and Barbados, were promising to free slaves in the 13 colonies for supporting the British side. Many Americans were talking about liberty and how British were treating the colonists as slaves, while owning slaves themselves was a tremendous feat of mind gymnastics. We decided we could not discuss the complexity and twists and turns during the Revolutionary War in the time frame of the podcast. We will return to this subject matter when we take a deep dive into the Revolutionary War next year. We also did not discuss the pushback from slave owners on reading the abolitionist tracts and the strategy used to counter the arguments. This pushback makes the issue become much more complex and violent from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. The last item where this podcast is deficient is highlighting enslaved individuals who either through slave rebellions, work stoppages, or passive resistance fought back against slavery. This information is very limited in the early 18th century, but we will hear from a former enslaved individual, Equiano, who bought his freedom and will become famous and influential in the abolitionist movement in the second part of this podcast. We will also discuss a significant slave revolt in Jamaica and pick apart a diary of a slave owner, Thomas Thistlewood, a truly horrible person. I did not know who Anthony Benesse was before reading about this topic, and now he is one of the people I most admire from this time period, a truly remarkable and enlightened individual.
So this is a very brief overview of the scattering of earliest documents and movements towards abolition. Of course, as with any movement that goes contrary to the majority in society, it's very slow to start and very few people are willing to take a stand publicly. There were many more anonymous pamphlets written, there were many more meetings, there were many people in the street muttering about the immorality and unfairness of slavery. However, there were not many voices willing to stand up and actually make a point. So we give you the very beginning of the movement, and in our next half of the episode, we will come back to the build-up and runaway train that the abolition movement becomes, along with the counter-movement to keep slavery as an institution in Britain and its colonies. So we thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you do find your podcasts. Make sure you stay tuned for our next episode. And if you are in the area, come on down to the museum today for our Juneteenth event. We have many local organizations coming out for celebrations, doing lots of different activities on lots of different sites throughout the museum. We'll also be focusing our interpretive activities on Juneteenth and the role and influence of Africans in American culture.
Thank you very much.